The morning mist clung to the hills surrounding the village of Kotsina like a shroud of forgotten dreams. Queen Nazima stood at the edge of what would become her greatest legacy, watching as the first stones were laid for what the villagers had begun calling Makaranta Mota, the school for girls. Her hands, adorned with the rings of royalty, trembled slightly as she remembered another morning, years ago, when she had knelt in a similar dusty courtyard, scrubbing pots while other children walked to school with books tucked under their arms. "Your Majesty," said Malam Ibrahim, the elderly village head, his voice heavy with concern, "the men are not pleased. They say daughters belong in their mothers' kitchens, learning to cook and clean, not filling their heads with letters and numbers that will make them disobedient." Nazima turned to face him, her dark eyes carrying the weight of memories that still haunted her sleep. At 26, she had ruled beside King Aminu for 9 years, but the scars of her childhood remained as fresh as yesterday's wounds. "Tell me, Malam Ibrahim, what becomes of a girl who cannot read when her husband dies and leaves her with children to feed? What becomes of a daughter who cannot count when traders come to cheat her in the market?" The old man shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands fumbling with his prayer beads. "These things are in Allah's hands, Your Majesty." "Yes," Nazima said softly, her voice carrying across the construction site where workers paused in their labor to listen, "but Allah also gave us minds to use. He gave us hands to build and voices to teach. When I see a girl child walking past a school she cannot enter simply because she was born female, I see Allah's gifts being wasted." She walked among the foundation stones, each one representing a battle she had fought. Against tradition, against prejudice, against the voices that whispered she was overstepping her bounds. This was her 5th school in 2 years, but the resistance grew stronger with each new project. The male elders saw her schools as a threat to their authority. Some of the women feared their daughters would become too proud, too independent, unmarriageable. "Your Majesty," came the voice of Fatima, a young mother who had been hovering at the edge of the crowd, her 7-year-old daughter Aisha clinging to her wrapper. "My husband says if I send Aisha to your school, he would divorce me and take his other wife as his only spouse. But," her voice broke, "I never learned to read. When the grain sellers come, they tell me prices and I must trust their words. When my son brings homework from the boys' school, I cannot help him. I do not want this for my daughter." The pain in the woman's voice pierced Nazima's heart like an arrow. She knelt beside little Aisha, seeing herself in the child's curious eyes, remembering the hunger for knowledge that had burned in her chest even as she scrubbed floors and tended to other people's children. "What would you like to learn, little one?" Nazima asked gently. Aisha looked up at her mother for permission, then whispered, "I want to read the Quran myself, not just memorize the sounds. I want to write my name. I want to know why the moon changes shape." Tears flowed freely down Nazima's cheeks as she heard her younger self speaking through this child's voice. She had asked the same questions once, received the same dismissive answers. Girls don't need to know such things. Girls need to learn to be good wives and mothers. "You will learn all of that and more," Nazima promised, taking the child's small hands in hers. "You will read not just the Quran, but poetry and stories and books about the wide world. You will learn mathematics and science and history. You will discover that the moon changes shape because of how sunlight falls upon it as it circles our earth." Standing slowly, she addressed the growing crowd of villagers. "I know some of you think I am destroying our traditions. But I tell you this, a tradition that keeps half our people in darkness is not a tradition worth preserving. I am not trying to make your daughters into men. I am trying to help them become the fullest version of themselves that Allah intended." The construction continued despite the grumbling and protest, but Nazima knew the real challenge would come when the school opened. She had seen it before. Parents who initially supported her vision would waver when neighbors criticized them. Girls who started with enthusiasm would drop out when marriage prospects were threatened. 3 months later, the school stood completed. A beautiful building with airy classrooms, a library that smelled of fresh wood and new books, and a courtyard where girls could gather under the shade of young mango trees that would grow tall as their education flourished. But on the first day of classes, only 12 girls arrived out of the 60 who had registered. Nazima stood in the empty classroom, her heart breaking as she watched the few brave girls who had come looking around uncertainly at all the vacant seats. Among them was Aisha, whose mother had defied her husband's threats, and Zora, a 15-year-old whose parents had died, leaving her to raise her younger siblings alone. "Your Majesty," said Hajia Rakia, the teacher she had recruited from the capital, "perhaps we should wait. Give the families more time to accept the idea." But Nazima shook her head, remembering all the times in her life when waiting had meant never, when postponement had meant abandonment. "No. We start today with 12 girls. Tomorrow we may have 13. These 12 deserve their education as much as 60 would." She sat in one of the student chairs, her royal robe spreading around her like a protective cocoon. "Tell me," she said to the girls, "what is the first thing you want to learn?" Aisha raised her hand tentatively. "I want to learn why some people say girls cannot learn the same things as boys. My brother says our brains are smaller." The other girls giggled nervously, but Nazima's expression was serious. "That is an excellent question, Aisha. And do you know what? Some of the greatest scholars in our history were women. In Timbuktu, women wrote books and taught at the university. In our own Hosaland, Queen Amina led armies and expanded kingdoms through her intelligence and strategy. Your brain is not smaller, it has simply been given fewer chances to grow." Day by day, word by word, equation by equation, the school began to transform not just the girls who attended, but their families and the entire community. Aisha's mother, Fatima, began visiting in the evenings, sitting quietly in the back of the classroom as her daughter practiced reading aloud. Soon, other mothers joined her, hungry for the knowledge they had been denied in their own childhood. The breakthrough came 6 months later when the village faced a crisis. A drought had withered the crops, and grain traders from distant cities arrived with their scales and their smooth promises. But this time, they were met by girls who could read their contracts and mothers who could calculate the true worth of their goods. "The price you offer for our millet is half what it sells for in Kano market," 12-year-old Hadiza announced boldly, her mathematics textbook tucked under her arm like a weapon. "We have learned to read the trade reports that come with the caravans." The trader, a man accustomed to taking advantage of illiterate villagers, found himself facing a room full of women and girls who could not be cheated. For the first time in the village's memory, they received fair payments for their harvest. That night, as the village celebrated their newfound prosperity, Malam Ibrahim approached Queen Nazima with tears in his eyes. "Your Majesty, I owe you an apology. I thought your schools would destroy our daughters. Instead, they have saved our village." But the moment that broke Nazima's heart and rebuilt it stronger came a year later, when Aisha stood before the entire village at the school's first graduation ceremony. The child who had once whispered her dreams now spoke with the clear voice of confidence. "My name is Aisha Fatima, and I can read," she announced, her small chin raised proudly. "I can write my thoughts and my dreams. I have learned that the moon changes shape because of shadows, that numbers can unlock secrets, and that girls are not smaller versions of boys, we are complete human beings with minds that deserve to be filled with knowledge. She paused, looking directly at her father, who had initially opposed her education but now sat in the front row with tears streaming down his face. I have learned that education does not make me less of a daughter or future wife. It makes me more capable of helping my family, more able to contribute to my community, more prepared to raise children who will make our village proud. The applause that erupted shook the very foundations of the school building. But Nazima barely heard it over the sound of her own heart, which seemed to be bursting with a joy she had never dared to imagine. This was her true victory. Not the defeat of slave traders or court conspiracies, but the sight of young girls standing tall with books in their hands and dreams in their eyes. As the ceremony ended and families gathered their newly graduated daughters, Nazima noticed an elderly woman sitting alone in the back. She approached slowly, recognizing something familiar in the woman's posture of regret. "I am Hajia Khadija," the woman said, not meeting Nazima's eyes. "I have watched your school for a year, Your Majesty. I have seen what it has done for these girls, and I..." Her voice broke. "I have been remembering my own daughter, who died in childbirth because she could not read the signs that might have saved her life. She could not count the days to know when to seek help." Nazima knelt beside the grieving mother, taking her weathered hands. "It is never too late to honor her memory. Come to our evening classes. Learn to read in your daughter's name, so that her grandchildren will know that knowledge is their birthright." That night, as Queen Nazima walked through her palace gardens, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been sold like livestock had grown into a woman who opened doors for others. The slave who had been told she was worthless had become the queen who taught children their worth was limitless. King Aminu found her there, standing beneath the stars with tears of joy on her cheeks. "My beloved," he said softly, "you look as if you have conquered the world." Nazima smiled, thinking of Aisha and Hadiza and all the other girls whose minds had been unlocked, whose futures had been transformed. "Not conquered, my king. I have built something better than conquest. I have built hope. I have built a future where no girl child will have to accept that her dreams are too small for her to reach." In the distance, the lights of the village school glowed softly in the darkness, and Nazima knew that tomorrow would bring new students, new dreams, and new possibilities. The queen who had once been denied education had ensured that no other girl in her kingdom would suffer the same fate. The schools would multiply, the knowledge would spread, and generations of girls would grow up knowing that their minds were treasures to be cultivated, not burdens to be hidden. This was Queen Nazima's greatest gift to her people, not just education, but the revolutionary understanding that every child, regardless of gender, deserved the chance to become everything Allah had created them to be.